Sacked in the morning was the cry from a section of Nottingham Forest fans after their defeat against FC Midtjylland in the Europa League. And it feels like the Ange Postecoglou experiment, I suppose, at Nottingham Forest is unravelling rather quick. That's 6 games now without a win for him and back-to-back defeats at the City Ground as they lost also against Sunderland at the weekend. But is the criticism of Ange Postecoglou fair, and are Nottingham Forest likely to turn their season around and get back to where they were sort of last season, aiming towards that top sort of 6 or 7? Let's talk about it in this video, but let me know what you think of Ange Postecoglou in his time so far at Nottingham Forest and whether or not he can survive this rather unsettling start to life in Nottingham. Let's dive into the video. So firstly, let's talk about the start for Ange Postecoglou. And I think he was in an unfortunate position replacing Nuno Espirito Santo, because Nuno had turned Nottingham Forest from a relegation threatened side into a team that was competing at the top end of the Premier League. Of course, he had a fallout with the Nottingham Forest owner. That meant that he was sacked. He's ended up at West Ham now. And it meant that when Ange Postecoglou came in, he was coming into a team that were previously on the up, and and he was going to have to try and replicate what Nuno did. But the key difference there is that this team was built largely in the vision of what Nuno Espirito Santo wanted, and not in the vision of what Ange Postecoglou wanted it. And it is already pretty clear when you watch Nottingham Forest that they aren't necessarily bought into the Ange style of play. It's not really clicking so far, and that's because they both played such a contrasting style. Nuno was very pragmatic, very counter-attacking, very defence first, but hitting teams quick in transition. And Ange Postecoglou likes to have his team pushing up high, getting the ball in the opposition's half and sort of pinning them in. And those are obviously two very contrasting styles. And the results so far have shown that that transition has not been smooth. They've lost against Arsenal, went out of the Carabao Cup against Swansea, drew with Burnley away. They drew with Real Betis in the Europa League, where they actually played really, really well. They then lost against Sunderland at the weekend, and now, of course, have lost in the Europa League against FC Midtjylland, which, you could argue maybe he's been a little bit unlucky. In that Sunderland game, for example, Chris Wood missed a really, really good chance, and they have had chances in all these games to score. It just hasn't been falling for them. They're lacking a bit of a clinical touch. How much of that can you blame on the manager? I'm not so sure, but you can look at the defensive side of things and how poor Forest have been with set pieces and how poor they've been defending transitions to say that, Ange is potentially having a negative effect there, even if they have been unlucky in the final third. And let's talk about the structural issues, because I think this is fundamentally the main issue that Nottingham Forest fans are having, and the main issues that I see with Nottingham Forest when I watch them. This is a team designed to be counter-attacking. They are designed to be a pretty defensive side that is quick. Last season they had Hudson-Odoi and Alanga, and those two are just fierce when it comes to counter-attack. And Morgan Gibbs-White as well, picking balls up and hitting teams in transition. That was the design of this team. This is what Nuno Espirito Santo had them doing. And then he's now, with Ange coming in, he's changing the way that these players are playing. So the effectiveness of a Callum Hudson-Odoi comes from the fact that he is so quick and pacey and can get in behind the defences. But if you are pinning the opposition in and playing in their half and not hitting them in transition, well, you are essentially nullifying Callum Hudson-Odoi's greatest strength, which is his pace. And we see this a lot with players that he has. Milenkovic, I think, is a prime example. One of the best centre-backs in the Premier League last season. Incredible player. But asking him to play so high up on the halfway line, I think, is a recipe for disaster, because Milenkovic is a player that is a fantastic defender, but he's getting exposed a little bit by making him play a role that he's not massively comfortable with. And this is the issue you see throughout this Nottingham Forest team. It just isn't designed to play this Ange style of football, and we're seeing them become unstuck. Milenkovic is a player that loves to defend, but he does not want to be turning around and facing his own goal, having to deal with players running in behind of him. That's just not what he wants to do as a player. And under Nuno, very rarely were Nottingham Forest caught in behind. They didn't really allow the opposition to do that. Under Ange, it's a hazard of his style of play, and we see that, and that's what we've seen so far with Nottingham Forest. And I think this comes down to, the decision to hire Ange sort of suggests that there was no thought process behind the way that Ange plays. Unless they said to Ange Postecoglou, can you replicate the Nuno style? But clearly we're not seeing that now. He's trying to change to play in his style of play. And Forest are dominating games, and they are having a lot of possession. They are creating sort of a lot of half chances, but they are not showing that clinical edge they had under Nuno. And I think that comes from the fact that the team was designed for transitional play and not to be dominating teams and, passing the ball around the edge of the box. As we saw in that Sunderland game, a lot of territory for Nottingham Forest, but not much penetration. And this is a team now that looks vulnerable at set pieces, which is something you would never have said under Nuno Espirito Santo. And they look vulnerable on counter-attacks. Again, something you would not have said under Nuno. And those are the fundamental issues that I am seeing right now with this Ange Postecoglou team. And I think very alarming is the 2 defeats at home. Look, Ange had 4 games on the road to start his time at Nottingham Forest, and that isn't ideal. And, you can look at the circumstances behind that. Were they ever going to get something at Arsenal? Probably not. They possibly could have beaten Burnley. They lost with 2 late goals against Swansea in the Carabao Cup. And, yeah, the game against Real Betis, we mentioned, they played fantastic in it and managed to get a draw. But the 2 home games are really alarming because Sunderland at home, look, you look on paper there, and look, Sunderland's had a really good start of the season. We've talked about Sunderland a lot on this channel and how good they've been, but that doesn't mean that they should be going to Nottingham Forest and winning a game of football, and Forest should be winning that game. In terms of the quality between the 2 teams, there is a bit of a gap there, and while Sunderland were organised and played well, they should be winning. And then last night we saw in the Europa League, losing that game 3-2 against a side that is probably comparable to a top-end championship team in terms of quality. That is a massive issue, and it's shown the defensive frailties of this team under Ange Postecoglou. And I think it was looking at Ange, is he learning lessons? Is he learned anything from his time at Tottenham, where, again, his teams were like this? They were looking pretty good, dominant in terms of territory, their attacking structures, and they're being so, pressing on the opposition. That's what he did at Tottenham, and they came unstuck. They finished 17th in the Premier League last season. They won the Europa League when he shifted to a more pragmatic style. We know he can do that, and I think for me, when he came in here, my thought is that maybe Ange just went, you know what, maybe the style now is going to be a little bit more pragmatic. But what we've seen at Forest is he's went back to, quote unquote, Ange ball. He's went back to playing that style of play that saw Tottenham finish 17th in the Premier League last season, and he was in Europe last season with Tottenham and the Premier League, and their record was abysmal. And the concern is that, is this going to happen at Nottingham Forest? And do Nottingham Forest have the leeway like Spurs did? Because last year, the Premier League, the bottom 3 was so weak, there was no danger of Tottenham ever getting relegated. Whereas this year, that is not necessarily going to be the case. And look, if we look at the relegation picture as a whole right now, the newly promoted teams all look much better. Sunderland have already got 11 points on the board. Leeds have got 8 points on the board and look strong. Burnley drew against Nottingham Forest recently, and they have picked up 4 points to start the season, but have had a really difficult fixture list. You've then got Nuno going in at West Ham, and Nuno, of course, we know from his time at Nottingham Forest, is going to be very, very good at getting that team organised and picking up points in the Premier League. We also have down there Wolves, who look like there's little bits of signs of life, and that is concerning because Forest are not expecting to be dragged into a relegation scrap this season. And look at the fixtures they've got coming up. They've got to play Newcastle, Bournemouth, Chelsea, Man United, Liverpool, and I think they've got Leeds in there as well in the Premier League. That's their next lot of games. And you look at that and you're not seeing a lot of points there with this Forest team playing the way it is. And that is a massive red flag for Ange and Nottingham Forest. 1 point from Burnley and Sunderland in their 2 Premier League games isn't good enough, and the trickier fixtures coming up, you do worry about where Nottingham Forest are going to be in a month or so's time. So my verdict on this, look, Ange deserves more time, but when a crowd begins to turn on a manager, the signs are never good. How often do you see sacked in the morning chants from home fans and see the manager come back and have, a long 2-3 year stint? It just doesn't happen very often. And I think the Forest ownership, being as chaotic as it is, Ange is possibly under more pressure. Would you be surprised if Marinakis has decided, do you know what, we're just going to cut ties on this and start again and bring somebody else in? You wouldn't. And it wouldn't be a shock if they made such a bullish change early into the Ange Postecoglou tenure. He needs results. He needs a result this weekend at Newcastle. He needs them soon. Otherwise, you fear that Ange Postecoglou is facing unemployment in the near future, and he probably does not deserve that. Look, it's early doors in his time at Forest. They have been pretty good in games, but yeah, very concerning for Ange so far. Let me know, though, what you think of Ange Postecoglou in his time so far at Nottingham Forest, and whether he can survive this rather sticky start to life at the City Ground. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. We'll catch you for another very soon.